So the last few years we've been talking about issues surrounding Islamic law, human rights, issues surrounding jurisprudence and the operational process of jurisprudence, and questions surrounding the use of the intellect and so on, and rational sciences and how they interact with each other. And one of the topics I really wanted to talk about was this idea of humanist ethics within medieval Islamic tradition, or the notion of morality, really. Because ethics is obviously a slightly different subject, but the notion of morality and how it stems from Islamic theology. And the concept of basically a-religious morality, non-scriptural, non-fideistic morality, and how that interacted within medieval Islam. Because the kind of traditional understanding of morality or mores or ethics or rules in Islam is fideistic. It's very much God said X, and therefore the ruling is Y. The Prophet said X, and therefore the ruling is Y. And there's a position that looks at Islam in a very simplistic manner, that it must always operate in this way. Actually, what I wanted to look at is two things. First of all, one thing I've not looked at before, which is how outside of Scripture, prior to looking at Scripture, before even entertaining a discussion about what does the Quran say, what is the prophetic tradition, is there a conception of morality that Islam accepted at a base level or not? And what was the medieval position surrounding this? And then how was that mainstreamed in its theology? How did it arrive into its theology first? How was it mainstreamed? And then are there examples of that within the jurisprudence that actually makes the point, or is this just really, really wishful thinking, which I think a lot of people tend to think it is? So to start with, how does the question arise? So the question arises, like all theological debate and discussion, it starts with God. It starts with debating and discussing, how do we know God? And for people who are interested in theology, they know this is a conversation, discussion, debate that is at the heart of creed or theology for people that study divinity or theological studies in every religious dimension. And specifically within Islam, it's a I'm going to say interesting because I'm assuming you're all interested. It's a fascinating debate around how do we know God that comes priori to Scripture according to the overriding majority of Sunni and Shia theologians in history. So what do I mean by this? I mean, if you have a concept of God that transcends, that comes first before anything else, it becomes the prism by which you look at Scripture. To give some examples of this, famously that, and this is something that's common within Judaic theological kind of reasoning, the Rambam's reasoning around, you have a concept of God first, which is rational. This concept then becomes the prism by which we interpret Scripture, that God cannot be. So for the overriding majority of Muslims in history, things that perplexed them when they were taken out of context were verses like, or hadith like, Yadullahi ma'al jama'. God's hand is with the congregation. The Ar-Rahman al-Arsh astawa. That the merciful arose above the throne. Because both of these things challenged Muslims in general, because our conception of God is transcendent, it's not human. And therefore describing God with physical attributes is problematic. A lot of us people who are interested in Maimonides knows that he describes God by what he's not. This is very similar to what we call in Ash'ari theology, sifat salbawiyya, or the munafi sifat, the negatory attributes of God. One of the fundamental tenets of our faith, for the overriding majority of orthodoxy, is mukhalafat al-hawadith, that God is not like anything which is accidental in the universe. There's nothing like him. Laysa kamithlihi shay, as the Quran says. There's nothing like whatsoever unto God. Lam yakun lahu kufuwan ahad. There's no similitude. There's no equal to God. So that concept underpins all of our theological beliefs. So then anything that seems to resemble humans, we know is not to be taken definitively at its primary lexical meaning. So the word hand primarily literally means that which is at the end of an arm. That's literally what the word means. So what some like to argue, well, it literally means hand, but it doesn't mean hand in the human sense. That's just a paradox. It's a linguistic absurdity. It's theologically fine if that's what you want to believe. It's perfectly reasonable in the sense that, you're free to believe it. It's not rationally reasonable in the sense that it is an absurdity. Some did historically take that position, but the overriding majority of Ash'aris and Maturidi jurisprudence, and even Atharis, like Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali, was, we take this, and either we don't know what it means, or we kind of do know what it means when God says that his hand is with the congregation. We know it's his approval. We know when God is arisen over the throne, what's the context of the verses? We didn't reveal the Quran to give you trouble. It wasn't revealed to you to cause you distress. It's just a reminder for those who have God consciousness. It's the merciful that occupies the throne. Chill out. This is the string of the verse. You get it from the plain reading. If you take it out of its context, you start debating something that's not the subject matter. You might get confused about, does God sit on a throne? How does he sit if he's not physical? Does he touch the throne or not? Is he contained by 4 dimensions or 6 dimensions, etc.? Or you may just be able to understand it simply as the verse is read and not trouble you, which is actually the plainer, ironically, as Ibn Hazm argues, the literalist, the more literal observation of the text. That's the more plainer reading of the text. So this starts, actually the rationale comes first. For the overriding majority of scholars historically then, Abil Hasan al-Ash'ari, Abu Mansur Maturidi, the 2 founders of their, 2 economic founders of their schools of theology. And throughout history then, the major big thinkers, your Fakhruddin al-Razis, your Imam al-Ghazalis, your Baqiranis, they generally come to the conclusion the intellect comes before scripture. And then there's a debate about whether sensory data comes before scripture or not. Because they differentiate things that are arrived at through proof, and for the philosophers here, differentiate between proof and evidence, and things that are arrived at through ancillary data or evidence, sensory perception, empirically, etc. And so, in general, though, they put the primacy to the intellect. And then they interpret anything which conflicts with that in a way that accords with the intellectual propositions which precede it. Now, this obviously sets up for a very interesting set of debates, discussions, and ideas. So you'll find then debates and discussions like, what is the first duty or obligation upon a human being? Muslim theologians discuss this. And the general view that Juwayni concludes, Juwayni was this great 5th century major jurist and scholar of Islamic law, Islamic principles of jurisprudence, but he was a mutakallim. He was a theologian, a scholastic theologian. And that's really why he's hugely rated. And his work is translated into English, the Irshad al-Aqawati al-Dilla fi Usul al-I'tiqad, the guide to the conclusive proofs in the principles of creed. And it's a really interesting translation. It's a really difficult text to translate. And it had many commentaries. And he goes through this discussion. He says the first obligation is to search for truth. The first duty on all humankind is to activate the intellect and search for truth. And then he has a debate. Do you necessarily arrive at God? And so he comes to the conclusion that learning philosophy, what we would call philosophy, obviously what they didn't call philosophy, but they called it just merely kalam, or merely theological reasoning. He says this is a duty, it's a fard, like prayer or fasting in the month of Ramadan. He says it's a duty to engage in theological reasoning, because without it you can't come to a definitive belief in God. And using the Sharia principle, مَا لَا يَتِمُّ الْوَاجِبِ إِلَّا بِهِ فَهُوَ وَاجِبٌ, wherever without which you can't establish a duty, that thing then becomes a duty. And he's criticized for this by people that say, very simply, that's just a bit much. You can't really expect. These elitist societies in medieval times, you can't really accept the amlug, the awam, the masses, the plebs, to really engage in theological reasoning. That's just a little bit much for them. but also because, as Ibn Baziza, the great commentator from Morocco, that he puts down, is that actually, more than that, you're placing the arrival at the belief in God as not being necessary. It's not a necessary truth. If you need to theologically reason it out, there's a certain level of ijtihad, effort involved at arriving at it, which means you can't really blame people for arriving at the wrong opinion. If they exert their effort and they come to the conclusion there isn't a God, actually you've taken away any religious liability from them because they've done their best, they're sincere. And this was the criticism that Ibn Baziza gives. It says, that's a really problematic position for him. Ibn Baziza then says, and also, something, there's a simpler way of arriving at the need for, reflection, is the dozens and dozens of verses of the Quran which say things like, أَفَلَا يَتَفَكَّرُونَ, do they not think? أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ, do they not reflect? إِنَّ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ, in the creation of the heavens and the earth, آيَاتٍ لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ, or signs for people of depth, لِلْمُتَفَكِّرِينَ, for those who think. There's literally dozens of these types of verses. And we know this famous narration, which Zamakhshari brings, and it's said to be narrated by Bukhari, where the Prophet is weeping whilst he's reciting a verse of the Quran, and his neighbors can hear him weeping, and they want to know why, and they find out, they inquire, and it's because he's reading the verses which say, أَفَلَا يَتَفَكَّرُونَ, do they not think, do they not reflect? And it's saying, woe to those who read these verses and they don't ponder. And it says, these verses, these prophetic traditions, Diya al-Iman, Nur al-Iman, Tafakkur, the light and the guide towards faith is reflection and pondering. He says, these things on their own are sufficient. You don't need to bring about some type of juristic principle to establish the need to reflect, rationalize, intellectualize, use and engage your mind to arrive at true faith. So, this obviously has all sorts of parallel discussions, because then, how do you then take the further discussions from there, that once you've established the ration as your center point for your theology, there's all sorts of things that come about. And I want to talk about a couple of examples of this. One is reflection on, and this was a long-winded way to come to the point that I actually wanted to start off with, which is reflection on morality. The whole discussion of what the usuli scholars used to call tahseen wa takbih aqlan, or can we decide things as right and wrong, pretty and ugly, that is the literal translation. Husn and qubh is prettiness and ugliness, but can you ascribe moral praiseworthiness or moral repugnance to human conduct using the intellect without recourse to scripture? And so the view, obviously the famous view of the Mu'tazilite scholars was, hell yeah, of course you can. What people then assume is the Sunni response was, no, you can't. Which actually is fundamentally misses the overriding majority of Sunni thought. The overriding majority of Sunni thought, Abu Mansur Maturidi, he says, no, of course you can. The question is, it's obvious that certain things are wrong. Injustice is bad. You wouldn't think it, because obviously the Russians can veto the Security Council resolution where 500,000 people are slaughtered in Syria. But it's self-evidently obviously bad. Murder is self-evidently obviously bad. Lying prima facie in origin is self-evidently bad. It's deceiving people. And so you have that as a start point. What they then debate is, should someone be held accountable to God for doing self-evidently bad things? And this is where the Ash'aris differ. And the Ash'aris will say no. Unless they are given definitive proof that God is going to hold them to account for doing bad things, God can't hold them to account for doing bad things, even though the internal impulse should tell you these things are bad anyway. So Imam al-Juwayni, in his book on Al-Burhan fi Usul, he says, look, of course we know, self-evidently we know certain things are bad, we don't need scripture to tell us. But our issue here is to do with religious accountability, and God says, مَا كَانَ مُعَذِّبِينَ حَتَّى نَبْعَثَ فِيهِمْ رَسُولِنَا. We don't punish a people until we send among them our messenger. So God has already given this criteria. So because God has given a way out to people, we should not close that door. And so the scholars take this further. Ghazali discusses this, and he comes to the conclusion that most people, bear in mind, Ghazali was a 5th, 6th century great jurist, the peak of Islam, essentially, the height of Islamic intellectual discourse. Muslims weren't generally seen as barbarians and terrorists in the day. Yeah? They were seen as leading lights. And yet, in his time, he says, the people in his time, in his Faisal al-Tafrika, again, which is translated into English, it'll come to me afterwards. He says, most of the people in surrounding villages of the Sadiq leadership, they've got a really distorted image of Islam. They could never, it'd be stupid for them to embrace Islam. Let's be honest, nowadays when someone embraces Islam, we're slightly skeptical. What happened? They got ginger hairs, or something been bullied in their life? Is there a reason that they've turned away from mainstream society? These are the debates that happen because people find it odd. It's no longer romantic and sexy. That those of you who I'm not looking at anyone when I say this. Those of you who are around in the 60s and 70s can remember that kind of aspirational, inclination of romanticism towards Islam. It's not. And so Ghazali says in his time it wasn't for the Anatolians, and so for them to not embrace Islam means they wouldn't be held to account. It'd be perfectly normal for them not to be held to account because the image of Islam that had reached them was so poor. And so this became their view. And then you have people like, I've still got 4 minutes, right? Or is it?
Yeah, about 3 minutes.
3. So Ibn Taymiyyah, who finally, he then grapples with this discussion as well, because Ibn Taymiyyah is seen as this really heavy, hardcore literalist. And he deals with this, with verses and hadith like, Rahmati sabaqat ghadabi. My mercy outweighs my anger. In a book written above the throne, it is stated, God wrote, my mercy outweighs my anger. Now Ibn Qayyim transmits this from Ibn Taymiyyah. It's a very famous position. It's, how could that be the case if people are punished forever? That doesn't particularly sound like your anger's subsided in any way if people are being punished for eternity. So this just doesn't, one of those things are not true. It's a merciful God or it isn't. His mercy outstrips its wrath or it doesn't. And so Ibn Taymiyyah took the position of Sayyidina Umar, radiallahu anh, which was a minority position, which said, look, people obviously are not going to be burning in hellfire forever. There's a punishment for their wrong deeds, but then hellfire will stop. Whether you had faith or not, you didn't have faith, hellfire will stop, and people will then be moved to paradise. And this was Ibn Taymiyyah's position. It was seen as a minority position, true. But that was his view and his way of reconciling these things. And so this didn't just affect the theology, it affected the substantive law. And I'm going to give probably the most extreme example of this because it's quite well known in jurisprudence. But there were 2 ways in which mainstream jurisprudence embodied this. One was how it became part of principles of Islamic law, and they have this doctrine called istihsan, which is to seek the good. And some of them afterwards, they quote verses of scripture saying, وَالَّذِينَ يَسْتَمِعُونَ الْقَوْلَ وَاتَّبَعُوا أَحْسَنَهَا. Those who listen to the scripture, internalize it, and follow the best part. But actually what they were saying is sometimes you follow scripture and you end up with a conclusion that's just really bad. So you need to just rethink it. And so that's what istihsan was, which the Hanafis took, or masalih, or looking for the public interest. That you read the scripture in a certain way and it comes to a bad conclusion, then you just drop it. And so I wanted to give one example of that, which I'm going to end on, which was the famous Salafi Imam. And I use the Salafis because, again, they're seen as very rigid, they're very scriptural, they're very ritualistic, they're very literal about everything. Imam Hassan bin Ahmed al-Jalal, who wrote his Daw an-Nahar in Yemen, the kind of like the light of day, the dawn of day, which is a commentary on Matan al-Azhar, a medieval text on Islamic law. And he's discussing penal codes, punishments which everyone knows about, which scripture says things like, you need to cut hands, you need to lash adulterers, you need to stone people to death. And he's saying, look, at the end of the day, these were there for purpose. They're not without purpose. They're there for a rational cause, which is to bring about betterment for people, and it's not to actually go around literally stoning people, cutting off hands. That's not the purpose in which they're there for. They're there to serve an end. And that end is better served both for the community, both for the people, by incentivizing it in a way that works for them. And so if that means financial penalties, if that means encourage them financially, then do that. Tax breaks, whatever, as we have for good families and so on, which preserve family values and so on, was a reasonable way. And he goes as far as saying, فَلَا وَجْهَ لِلْمَنْ. There is no way to say this is not allowed in Islamic law, because the purpose behind it is to achieve these ends, these maqasid, these purposes. And he's a literalist Salafi scholar, and he has this literally, he's Dawan Nahar. That actually the conception of looking at rational goals, public interest, the curving of scripture when it gets slightly out of hand, is something that is inherent to medieval Islamic jurisprudence. And I hope that's a start for our conversation.